Welcome, everybody. We're back. And then I just made it home in time from what is now home for us here in Glasgow from COP26. And yeah, maybe even before we start into the conversation tonight with Dr. Ruby Mendenhall, who's another one of our wonderful advisory board members for the Pocket Project. Maybe we can just take a moment together to arrive more fully in the space. Just taking a moment to allow our bodies to land in the beautiful spot of Mother Planet that each of us sits on. Giving thanks for gravitation. Giving thanks for home in body, home on planet. For this one and precious life that we're in right now. Giving thanks for the breath that flows in and out. And if we allow ourselves to flow with it, it has its own rhythm that takes us. And connects us to the bigger rhythms of the cosmos, of the universe, the ebb and flow of the oceans, the turning of the moon, the explosions of the sun, the stars. Let's also welcome our hearts today that are being stretched in many ways as we attend to the reality of climate crisis and this convening of voices that is happening here in Glasgow. This huge question in a way that life is posing us. Do you love each other enough to change? Yeah, and whatever is alive in your emotions today, let's welcome that. Let's welcome our minds that are trying so hard at times. We invite our minds to settle. And our souls that are calling us here. And you can switch to gallery view for a moment and just give thanks also for this wee space that is coming together. Hmm. Thank you. And yeah, I would love to just welcome Ruby here and say a few words about her. So Ruby is a professor of sociology, African American studies, urban and regional planning. So interesting, Ruby. Earlier today, we were speaking with May East, who's also an urban planner. Gender and women's studies and social work at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Ruby is an associate dean for diversity and democratization of health innovation at the Carle, Illinois College of Medicine. Her research examines how living in racially segregated neighborhoods with high levels of violence affects Black mothers' mental and physical health. Using surveys, interviews, crime statistics, police records, and much more. And I'm so grateful that we can bring you into this conversation, Ruby, to share some of your experience with us today. And I thought I would just bring back some of what we shared today about communities on the front line of climate change. And we shared, that millions globally are already fleeing their homes because of floods, storms, droughts, wildfires, and also the incredible injustice of climate change, where developing countries pollute less per head of population. They're more willing often to reduce their emissions immediately, and they are not responsible for the emissions of the past. Yet they experience the worst effects of climate change and have least resources for adaptation and protection. Over the last 50 years, more than 2 out of 3 deaths caused by extreme weather, including droughts, wildfire, and floods, occurred in 47 of the least developed countries. Yeah, maybe just to leave it there, but that stark information just about the injustice on a global level, and then of course that is also reflected within countries like the United States, So Ruby, as you hear this and as you face the reality of historic injustice shaping the reality of the communities that you work with every day, how do you feel with that? How does this land in you?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me here to talk. I am looking forward to our conversation. So it really is difficult to hear, to think about, to process, right, the magnitude of it, both in terms of time, historically, and then also kind of how it's playing out currently. And I'll even maybe just say a little bit about how I came to be here, and then also kind of tie in how my work really is looking at resiliency. It's looking at like, how do we solve these big problems, right? How do we solve them on the societal level, on the structural level, and then also kind of on the individual level. So my background is in occupational therapy, and I worked at Cook County Hospital in Chicago, then Cook County, now John Stroger's. And I was on the protective service team. And so mothers would come in and their children were failing to thrive, some fathers, but primarily mothers. And the children weren't growing like they should. And so we would ask, right, the protective service team, the medical profession in general, like, what's wrong? Are you able to take care of your children? Do you not know how to take care of them? And over, I would hear, especially from Black and Latinx moms, that they didn't have enough money. And so they were watering down the formula. And that's why their children weren't growing. And so after hearing it over and over, I was like, okay, this isn't an issue with the mothers. This is a societal issue, right? Like, will we as a society provide enough money for parents to feed their children? So that led to my interest in public policy. So I went to school, University of Chicago, and studied public policy. When I graduated, I worked at the Ounce of Prevention Fund. I'm in Chicago. I don't know if any of your listeners know about that, but it was a wonderful program. I worked with Kids Public Education and Policy Project. And so we worked with legislators on childcare, on welfare issues, again, around how do you get money to mothers and families who need it. And so while I was there, we put in a grant for early Head Start. And so many people at the time knew about Head Start for preschool children, but they were starting it for children 0 to 3.
Sorry,
So
just Ruby, early what?
It's called Early Head Start. So like in the US, like there's kindergarten, right? So you go to kindergarten, first grade, and all of that. And then they had Head Start to give children kind of like an early exposure to schooling. And then they started what's called Early Head Start. So even before preschool, it was for children for 0 to 3 years old. And it was new, and this was in the 90s. So it's kind of old now, but it's based on the idea that one of the critical periods in development is from 0 to 3 years of age. And so that program, yep, we put in a grant, we received it. And I wanted to go to Robert Taylor Homes. It was then a public housing community. And I wanted to go there and work with the program. And many people were like, well, why would you leave downtown and go to Robert Taylor, which was high levels of violence? It was a low income community. And I was trying to answer something that was coming up in the policy meetings. And I was usually the only Black or the only female, right? And certainly the only Black female in many of the meetings. And I used to look around the table, right? We could think about the same thing with climate change and other pressing things that are happening and say, well, why aren't the people who are affected, why aren't they around the table, right? Why aren't they kind of talking from their lived experience? And so that's why I went to go to Robert Taylor Home to kind of get a sense of what mothers who were struggling and fathers who were struggling needed, or non-binary as well. And so I went to work in Robert Taylor's, very insightful, very, it was filled with a lot of stress. There was a lot of gun violence. And so I remember just the pressure and the fear, all of that rolled into one. And I think that also is influencing some of what I do now. So after being at Robert Taylor, still seeing mothers struggling to put food on their table, I went to Northwestern and got a degree in human development and social policy. So trying to merge both of those. And then I started doing research on segregated neighborhoods and how they affected economic outcomes, right? So still kind of following this flow of money. When you don't have money, right, it affects your life, your world in a lot of ways, from being able to feed your children to mental health needs to what many talk about too in terms of gun violence. So got a degree, looked at how neighborhoods, Black segregated neighborhoods affected economic outcomes. But one of the things that I thought was really important, even as I was doing that, was the importance of building up neighborhoods where we live. There were some programs, Moving to Opportunity, even the Gautreaux program, that would move African Americans out of their predominantly Black neighborhoods to other neighborhoods. And I think, you know, that's fine that, when people want to move into segregated areas, but we also have to invest in Black, brown, other neighborhoods that have not received the resources that they needed over time. And so again, when you think of climate change and how it intersects with historical discrimination, how it intersects with environmental racism and all of that, right? Like you have to think about all of those forces operating at the same time. So I looked at neighborhoods and continue to look at neighborhoods. And so now my research looks at how gun violence affects the mental health of Black mothers. And I do research also that has people kind of on the forefront talking about what's affecting them, like I did in my days with the policy clinic. And I can talk a little more about that, but general, the idea is that those who are impacted by what's happening, if it's gun violence, if it's racism, if it's climate change, that they're at those decision-making tables and saying, this is what's important, this is what's needed. And then they're kind of creating their own solutions, because in many ways, they're doing that already because their life depends on it, right? When they have to move from one community or even one country to another, their life, their mental wellness depends on their ability to adapt, their ability to take advantage of the resources that are available to them. And I think that's what universities and other organizations that have those resources, that's kind of what's needed for us to partner with those groups to make sure as much as possible that they are doing well. And then that's in addition to addressing, again, on the structural level, if it's more money that's needed, if it's for the different countries to come to an agreement, like all of those are critical to address at the same time that you're also addressing what people need who are in those situations. So that's kind of my story. And I guess I learned over and over again that even sometimes, like I have a lot of big ideas, right? And even sometimes I'm scared to tell people about the big ideas that they have. But even as I talk about them sometimes and move forward, and I don't have all the pieces together, but different people will come and bring some of what I need. Resources will come. So that's also what I've learned in my journey, that when you started, when you have the idea, when you can see something different from the way it is, it's not always in one complete package, that sometimes it just takes kind of moving forward, and then things are added that you need or that others need. And so that's what I try to do as I kind of work with different groups, and even around climate change. As and I know we'll talk about it later, but as I'm working on this, how do you democratize health innovation, tools that we're creating, infrastructures that we're trying to build, I think about what would people benefit, like refugees or others. What do I have the power to create that they would benefit from?
Yeah, I mean, I think this democratization, bringing deep democracy to the decision-making processes in our world, that seems like the key element of what you just spoke about, And I think today, more than any of the days before, has really brought it home to me also. In COP this morning, I was listening to a young woman from the Amazon who had spoken and is now receiving death threats. And she was speaking about what it felt like as an Indigenous woman, because she addressed like a high-level forum to speak in front of this huge group of predominantly white men, and just what it felt like in her body, how terrifying that is, but also just and again and again, we hear that the actual experience on the ground. So we had the head actually of the Nepalese delegation with us today, and she was sharing how, she is working towards this, but even within her own delegation, it's like the high level class in her country that is chosen to be part of the Nepalese delegation. So they don't have contact to the grassroots communities that are really in the forefront of experiencing the changing monsoon, the floods, losing their homes, losing their fields, you know, the wildfires that they've had. So they're already distant. And then they come here, and here at the table, they don't really get their voice in, you know. So there's such a huge distance from where the actual forefront of climate change is to where the decisions are being made. And I think that is being reflected in the kind of decision making that we're seeing. You know, so I love what you bring there. And I wonder, like, whether you could bring alive, you know, just around the work that you do, you know, what would, for instance, a young Black mother, what would she say she needs, you know, in your experience, like, or a youth, you know, what are they calling for?
Yeah, so that's great. So when you talked about that, one thing that does kind of level the playing field, again, although structural racism and other forms of oppression needs to be addressed, right? That's always on the forefront, and it's also the hardest to address, which is why it continues over and over. But one thing that we're doing to try to get those voices out is called citizen science. Some community-based participatory research, and then others kind of put it in the context of citizen, and then even / community science. So you don't necessarily have to be a citizen of a place, but just part of that community. And the internet, right? Like, you can put your voice, you can put your pictures, you can put your experience on there. And so that's what we did with one project around COVID-19 when it just started. And we didn't know how it was going to turn out. And we had it was from the state of Illinois. We had different people just kind of write about their experiences, what they needed, what was working, what wasn't. And something that came up was, you know, like there's homeless individuals who were downtown, and then they put the hand washing stations downtown. And then the person on the ground was like, yes, it's nice that they have those stations, but they don't, the ones that they were working with weren't changed regularly, right? So that's kind of a policy issue that had health implications during the middle of a pandemic that came up. When we talk about the youth, one of the things that I'm working with another group, Association of Black Psychologists, the Black Psychiatric Association, and others, around building this mental health ecosystem, right? For the US, we recently just talked about 400 plus years of racial trauma, intense racial trauma that affect resources, that even affect life chances, right? And the amount of years that you live. David Satcher's work talked about that there were 83,000 excess Black deaths a year, meaning people who died more than what you would expect from old age, or more than what you would expect from disease. And in the documentary, Unnatural Causes, Is Inequality Making Us Sick? They likened it to a plane full of African Americans falling out the sky every day, every year. So I always also talked about, it's a lot of grief in the Black community and in others, but you know, the Black community is the one that I am working with intimately. And that, so the group that I'm working with that I mentioned, we're trying to build this Black mental health ecosystem. And a big part of that is workforce development, right? Is having enough trained individuals who can provide the mental health resources. And so that's something that we're working to bring. And part of that, we argue, is starting young with the young people. So we're also doing training them as community health workers, right? Which is around the world, right? The model is around the world. It's not a new model, but it's about having peers who are trusted, who are part of the community, being able to disseminate and again, democratize, right? Information around health and wellness, especially what we're learning about neuroscience and the connection to mind, body, and how stress really can get under your skin and devastate your health. And I saw someone in the chat talked about my connection to the Institute for Genomic Biology. We actually did a study where we went into one of the communities in Chicago, and we asked the mothers, what is it like living in neighborhoods with high levels of violence? What is it like knowing that your child could be hurt, or going to funerals where children were hurt? And then also we took about 5 milliliters of their blood to kind of see how the immune system responded to individuals who reported high levels of stress. And so that's another thing that we feel is important to understand, especially from those who are on the ground in those communities, what it's like and how that stress affects them. But then also we ask the mothers, what do you need to be well? What are you doing that helps you cope with this high level of stress? And one of the mothers, when we were finishing up interviews, she waited and she said, you know what, I just want to thank you for coming and talking to us about what it's like to be in these spaces, and then also what we need. And then it kind of struck me, and she said, the little things matter, and people don't understand that. And it was interesting to me, and again, to your question about what do people need, because I went in as the principal investigator saying, okay, what policies do we need to change? Do we need to move around, right? What do we need to disrupt? And I heard her say that asking me what it feels like to be in these spaces and asking what do we need collectively was in some ways recognizing her humanity that also is at question, right, in the US, right? We're still in the midst of a social moment around police violence and other ways that people of color humanity isn't recognized. So that's a big one too, right? Having resources come into the community on the structural level that foster health and wellness, that provides jobs, that allow people to get access to higher education, because part of why we don't have the workforce that we need to address mental health is the lack of access to schools, to higher education. Even when you get the education, sometimes discrimination and other forms of exclusion can prevent you from being in those professions. So let me sum it up in a nutshell. On the larger level, people need systemic change, right? They need equality in this country and other places. And then on the individual level, I would argue, and that's where a lot of my work is, the understanding about how those issues of inequality affects both physical and mental health. And now people are even saying it's health, right? It's one, that mental health is physical health. And how do you help people understand that and then prevent the diseases associated with the wear and tear of the body over time? And again, so you can prevent these excess deaths and people can be around to love, live the years that they should do. So I would say those things. And again, with the young people, we're just now starting a program where they're going to work with us to create a training. And then we're thinking about how do we kind of put it on a larger scale, again, with the youth helping and driving us and giving us some of the solutions that they're already dealing with. And then together, collectively, we come up with more solutions. And we're actually going to create a wellness store. We have a brand new CIVO Center for Design, working with Rachel Switsky. And whatever the young people say that they need, whatever their parents, because it'll be an intergenerational program, the grandparents, the Sunday school teachers, like whatever information we get that helps us to foster health and wellness, we're going to try to put it in a wellness store in some ways and make it accessible. And again, thinking on a global, large scale level, that if it's helpful for some, that it may be helpful for others, again, with the twist that you adapted to the context, right? Because the South Side of Chicago is one context, and then other places, the context is different.
Yeah, thank you. You know, and there's something about what you just shared, which again connects to what we heard in the global social witnessing just before, is that how much it connects to human dignity.
Yeah.
To be asked, so what is really happening for you? And how is that for you?
Yeah. Yeah.
And to just bring that human interest and a true listening and a true heartfulness, you know, where you're with the person. It's not just a formula, but how that in itself restores human dignity, or humanity, as you called it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's very touching, you know, that's simple. And I guess that also connects very much to the work that we do in the Pocket Project, where in a way that simple bringing presence and precision to traumatic events, to, you know, just lives, that starts a healing process, you know, that it's as simple as that. That's where the healing process starts. And then there's something else that you're speaking about, which is like, you know, including the mothers, including the youth in the design of their healing contexts, their healing environments. And, you know, there's, because, you know, this question of, so how are you really doing, is like, it's in a way so simple, right? And I think what another thing that many people are finding is that as we heal, we heal. So as we offer something to others, if we can learn to be like a neighborhood health worker, you know, whatever you, but if you can train up youth to do this kind of work, that will heal them, you know. And just before I pass back to you, I know that one of the most successful programs here in the UK against teenage pregnancies, to stop teenage pregnancies, is actually offering teenagers the chance to support kindergarten children that don't have enough social care. So young, vulnerable teenagers are brought in and, you know, as they take care of young children, just a few hours a week. And this relationship changes everything for them, because suddenly their sense of self-worth rises, but also, you know, and it just brings down teenage pregnancies very quickly. Anyway, so with that, I just want to pass back to you and, yeah, hear more about this, the brave leadership in a way that you see arise from some of the women and some of the youth that you've been working with.
Yeah, and then just a few things. So I had the pleasure, right, for the Trauma Summit to interview Nobel laureate Lima Bowie, and I remember her talking about just kind of the presence of being, right? Because I was in awe, right, with kind of just the bold, audacious things that she did, and was remembering too when it was time to vote for a new leadership, and how her group went with the women and was saying, okay, let's go vote. And they were like, well, you know, I have to do this at the house. And so the women would actually do that for the other women, right? There was ironing clothes. Oh, I don't have childcare. I'll watch your child, right? So this of having someone walk beside you and providing those tangible resources, I think is very important. And I think we, and that's something that I'm interested in evaluating, right? Kind of this collective efficacy. And then also when you talked about the, as you heal others, you yourself are healed. And then in the Pocket Project, I remember there was a triad I was in, and it was around George Floyd murder, and it was, you know, COVID, all stuff was going on. So I was in the triad, and I like took up a lot of time, right? And I was like, oh man, I didn't need to take up all that time. And then I can't remember who said it, but someone said, no, that's fine, because as you heal, we heal. And I thought that that was very powerful. So you made me kind of think of that moment. And then there is research, and I can't remember exactly where I saw the study, but it talked about physicians and how they work with individuals. And it talked about one time in their research, there was a physician taking care of an undergrad, right? Lots of our research is done on undergrads. And he had a cold, and the doctor was like, wow, it must be hard for you to have a cold. I know you're in the middle of finals. That must be hard for you. And then, the student responded. And the research showed that for the doctors who asked patients about their interiority, right, like what was going on in their lives, that those patients tended to do better. So I think it's very powerful. There is research that talks about that.
Just wait.
Mhm.
Sorry, I would just love that to land. So basically, the doctors who really take the time and the emotional bring, let's say, the emotional care of, so how is this actually for you?
Mhm. Mhm.
What is actually happening for you
Yeah.
with this disease?
Yeah.
That those people heal better.
Mhm.
That's
Faster,
what I'm
right?
saying.
That they heal
They heal
faster.
faster.
And so when you asked on the ground,
Amazing.
so here's kind of like a
Yeah.
hot off the press. We haven't even kind of finished thinking about this yet, but we're trying to think about the interaction between physicians and patients, especially patients of color or LGBTQ patients. And so there's a simulation center here. And so we're thinking about like what ways could we change the environment to kind of foster this physician-patient contact, right? Because a lot of the, some of the interaction, I won't say all of it, but some of it is physicians putting information into the computers. And sometimes it's hard to kind of shift between the computer and the patient and to be present, right? And to kind of ask about that question, and even to let people tell their stories. And I don't know, well, I know even for myself, right? Like based on how the physician interacts with me, that many times determines how much information that I provide. And so just trying to have them be aware and to think about questions and things that come up. For instance, and I don't even know if this is so much, I think it could be race, but it's also could be class. So maybe it's the intersection of race, class, gender. Like sometimes physicians, right, or when I'm in the doctor's office being screened, they'll ask about depression or they'll ask about domestic violence. But I'm like, but you all never ask about stress, right? Like, there's a lot of stress going on in my world, and then other people, especially as I said, around George Floyd and other things, and we know what stress can do. And so that's also something that we're thinking about. How do you kind of build those into screenings, especially around racialized or other forms of stress that different groups on the margins experience, that is also is often silent in different places, but really play a role in terms of health and wellness, in terms of mental health. And so those are just some of the things that we're thinking about on a policy level, right? Because I'm always going to try to do the structural issues and then the individual issues. When we train the community health workers in Chicago, the young people up to age 21, we're also going to have policy clinics where legislators will talk with them about public policy, right? What is it, right? As a society, we have these rules, these kind of ways that we operate, and it determines who gets resources, who doesn't. It determines if some actors are polluting the environment more than others, right? We try to have levers that help them to encourage them, right, carrot or stick, to not pollute as much, or to donate some of their wealth, their resources to changing it, right? Kind of letting them know this is policy, and it's really important. A lot of people, it's kind of noise in the background, but to try to bring it to the forefront. Now, with doing something like that, you have to be careful in our sense in that we don't advocate or that it's nonpartisan, but it's still important that young people understand that their lives, their well-being, the well-being of their community is governed by these different things. And so that's, again, is another way to try to address these structural issues at the same time that you address the individual issues. And then another way that we're trying to address the structural issues is to bring 50 organizations, it may even be like 100, but to bring these organizations, many of them grassroots, who are on the ground, who are doing the work, but without resources, right? There are many people always trying to make the situation better. My dissertation advisor, one of my dissertation advisors, Phil Bowman, talked about whenever you see high levels of oppression and crisis and lots of things happening, at the same time, look for the resiliency, right? Because the level of resiliency is the same or similar because, right, people are trying to survive, people are trying to thrive, and that's what it means to be human and dignity. And so how do you tap into that and then amplify it? So that's what we hope to do when we bring the 50 organizations together to tap into what they're already trying to do around gun violence, around climate change, that may be having more storms, that's flooding, that's leading to mold, that's triggering asthma, like all of these things. And then also what I really like about the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, it's a land grant institution, right? So those are universities where their mission is to improve the lives of residents in the state, and then also, you know, nationally and globally. And so my idea is I talk about this new term called Communiversity Science, where it's this blending of community resources, community genius, community knowledge, right? Like they are knowledge producers. Often in the academy, we think that they're not, right? But they are knowledge producers because they have this cultural wealth, this cultural wisdom, this cultural adaptation, this cultural power from dealing with all the things that they have to do. How do we blend that with the science and what we bring from the university, and then create something that's really transformative, that's really powerful? And part of the power that, again, power in both places, but part of the power that the university brings is that it's all of these departments, right? Like I'm working with someone in engineering who has this fabric, I like to call it this magic fabric, that we put in a proposal around climate change, around environmental justice, that the fabric can be used to create a barrier. So when the heavier rains come, it can prevent that surge from coming that then floods people's homes, floods their car, then they lose everything. They may have to move, which means they lose the wealth in their home. I mean, all of those consequences, right, that fall out. So that's engineering. So we're also trying to think about how to build smart, affordable, healing homes, and that's architecture. But then you want it to be beautiful, right? So that's landscape architecture on the outside. So how do we bring genomic biology, right? The stress, and then how do you measure if you have those things taken care of, then the stress should be less, and how do you get at that? And so that's what I argue with Communiversity Science, that it really is, it really can be something powerful. And I don't know if we've seen it kind of on the level of almost like a total university. So maybe 10, 20 departments involved in one neighborhood, right? Economics, economic development, wealth creation, all of that. So again, when I talk about some bold, audacious ideas that I should be scared to to kind of put out there, that's kind of one of them. And actually for proposal, we did have like 30 departments and units working with us. But then some of the feedback was that it was kind of too big, right? It's kind of too complicated. What do you do with that? And I know the National Science Foundation is now talking about convergent science, where they bring different people together, different organizations. And as I looked and I read it, I said, but I don't see the community, right? Where's the community in that equation? So I did a lightning talk, and I think you can Google it, it should come up, but it's Ruby Mendenhall, Communiversity Science, National Science Foundation lightning talk that talks about you can have all those experts and other people with that knowledge, but if we don't have the knowledge from the university, I mean, from the community, then what would the science look like, right? What would be absent? What biases? And the stakes are too high, right? Like there's so much inequality, oppression. I talked about the excess Black death. People are losing their lives literally at the hands of others, but also from this slow kind of death by stress. So that was a real long answer. I didn't need to make it that long, but that was some of it.
Yes, that was really long, Ruby. Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, the idea, and it was so interesting. I think I told you before that a very good friend of mine from Nigeria actually came up with the same term. Dr. Anselm Andodo, who also coined the term communiversity and uses it for his work with the communities in Nigeria, where he honors their knowledge about place, about plant medicine, about, you know, so many things. And he uses that to create herbal medicines that he's now exporting all across West Africa. Just so interesting. But yeah, and also, you know, as you speak about the holistic knowledge, and I'm just thinking about the language creation, the culture creation that goes on also in some of those youth groups, right? I mean, it's rich. You walk into there and, you know, it's a different world. And it's, yeah, extremely rich. And to really honor that as the incredible creative surge that it is. So could you share a bit more about the resilience and the health that, you know, and I'll just say from the outside, it feels to me as if the resilience of African Americans is growing, the visibility, the outspokenness, the clarity, you know, this is who we are, we're here, you know, we want the system to change, that is really coming out more. How is your experience around that? And what would you say are the main sources of resilience of African Americans in the US?
Yeah, and on the Communiversity Science part, so I'm saying like Communiversity Science is kind of what I'm coining as the new term, and Communiversity, yep. So your person that you mentioned, and then also I first heard the term from, I think it was Katrina Wilcher and the NAACP here, that had like a parent communiversity. So lots of people have thought about that term. And I think because it does show like this partnership, right? Kind of this bringing people together. So, and I'll be short this time in terms of resiliency and the African-American community. I always go back to, you know, even in Africa, right? Like how did my ancestors and other ancestors survive the Middle Passage, right? That's a whole level of resiliency. That's a whole level of you know, I may not understand what's ahead of me, but I'm going to survive this moment. And then also with slavery. And even I have some stories from my own family in terms of resistance, right? With the revolts from slavery, but then also one of the key things that we still see today is the extended family network, right? Like and we talked before, right, about the importance of having individuals come and be with you and stand beside you. And in the Black community and others, right, the importance of kinship networks, right? Creating these deep bonds with individuals that is as close as family, right? That can help you during hard times. Carol Stack did research, I think it was here in Champaign, about mothers. Her book was All Our Kin, and just kind of talked about the ways that they shared resources. And even in my own work, when I talked to mothers in Inglewood, there was this one mother who lived in an abandoned building, and she had kids. And there was a neighbor who would let her come cook a hot meal and then kind of take the hot meal back to her children, right? So kind of this support on that level. And then also, again, the collective voices that we saw, again, with the slave revolts, with abolitionist movement, with civil rights movement, Dr. King as one of the leaders, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, but also the people behind them, the ordinary people behind them who sacrificed and who said, no, right, this isn't how it's going to be. I will sacrifice. I will not get on the bus. I will do this, and to shift and to change this society. And even again, when we saw the protests after George Floyd and others. So I would say that it's always there. Again, with the Great Oppression, there's great resiliency, but there are historical moments when it bubbles up and it creates a shift. And I think with some of the policies now, I think the shift and the demand for change has reached it on some levels, but still more needs to happen. So I would say that with the collective voices, with the protest movement, we're working with some people around technology, right? Doing a paper on Twitter, looking at over 12 million tweets and how people create community on Twitter, how they create resources, right? So there was one tweet that said, you know, police were arresting people, they need bail money. If you want to contribute, like, this is where you go, or here's some information. And that's also resiliency and resistance, but using technology that we have to do it kind of on a global scale. So those are some examples that I would give.
Wow, but so rich. I mean, what a, yeah. And I also, you know, I like Saskia's comment also in the chat, you know, that it seems to her that the resiliency and the activity has always been there. And it's more that white people are finally waking up to it, you know? Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Ruby. Maybe just as a, you know, as a last question, and then I would like to just open it up in case somebody from our audience here has a question to you. But yeah, what is your vision for the future, you know, in the work that you do?
Yeah. So one of, I guess, my big, bold, audacious plans is to try to think about how do we get complete equality, right? So even as I talk, right, you know, scared to say some of it, but how do we get complete equality? When I did a TED talk, I do recognize the change, right? I talked about, I am not standing before people, I'm not talking to this audience now as an enslaved woman, right? So there were protests and movements that changed that, right? Put that out. And then in terms of Jim Crow, and you have to hesitate, right? Because in some ways, some places are just as segregated, if not more, with Jim Crow and the lack of access. I have a colleague, Sundiata Chajua, who talks about this period as a new nadir. When you think about deindustrialization, access to living wage jobs, who's in higher education, right? I do programs that encourage young people from diverse backgrounds in STEM, right? In terms of African Americans, the numbers around 2%. In terms of medicine, in terms of everything, for all these years, the numbers have remained the same. So I'm a little, my voice gets a little softer when I talk about Jim Crow, but at least legally, right? We aren't still in Jim Crow. And then, so what's next, right? What does the next push for equality and hopefully the final push. So really trying to think about that and talk to individuals, right? Different people have different ways about that. And then also, I think part of it for me and for my work, like what I can lend my gifts and talents to is a renaissance, is thinking about the role and the importance of art, music, and all of that in healing, but also transformation, right? And motivating people in being able to tell stories about what's happening, and even creating connections. I think someone in chat was asking about connections both across disciplines. I've done that, and sometimes it's hard because you speak different languages. Sometimes you have different interests, and so it's important that you can stay at the table until the language is kind of common. And then what the beautiful thing that I've seen is then you end up creating something that you couldn't create separately without each other's kind of knowledge. And so, and I think art can do that too, right? Can put those difficult questions, the ugly, right? The death, the oppression, the inhumanity, the climate change, and all of that in ways that can move people and have people think differently. So that's what I want to spend a lot of time and work with those who are already doing an amazing job at kind of doing that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ruby. Yeah, and we're going to take another 15 minutes. So Ruby also needs to go in 15 minutes. And so we're keeping it a bit shorter. And just hear some of your questions. Anyone, maybe raise your hand if you would like to come forward. And yes, Larissa, let's pass it to you. So you can just unmute yourself, Larissa. There you go.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mendenhall. You've given us a lot of information. And I understand the value and the necessity of being specific in your context and your historical references. But I feel a bit nervous about the way that doing it that way can make it seem as though these issues are out there somewhere. Whereas for me, I feel they're right here. This space is reflective of the same demographics that every other space I walk through is. And as a person of color, it's a defining circumstance. So especially in these spaces that are enlightened, that are presenting as part of the solution, that are really helping in some very important ways. For me, dealing with the issues of trauma, very, very fundamental, but are still manifesting the same racially stratified, top-down, upside-downness of the world. So I would be interested in hearing what suggestions you have about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Larissa, for bringing that up. And I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. When you say in here, you mean kind of like on this call, in this space, in the Pocket Project kind of, okay.
That's right.
Okay.
This
Yes,
community that we're in.
Okay, yes. And Kosha and I were actually talking about that before we started. So I'll let her kind of jump in as well. But I will say that I have been a part of many conversations with people, or several, I should say several, in the Pocket Project where that has come up and where they are trying to address it and see it as an issue, especially as you say, when many see it as a space of talking about trauma on the different levels, right, from ancestral, individual, generational, to really what shifts, right, can be made so that it does feel fundamentally different than being a traditional white space that you would see in different places. And so I'll let Kosha kind of talk about some of the changes, but I know, like I said, we've had conversations and even we're doing, I guess with the global social witnessing and one of the calls, I'm trying to think, it's November 22nd on grief and grace. And so you'll see us kind of talk some about race and trauma kind of and healing too in that space as well. But I'll let Kosha kind of talk officially what the Pocket Project is doing.
Yeah, you know, I don't even know whether I can add a lot, Larissa. I just really honor you and thank you for bringing this and stating it so clearly, and also how uncomfortable it feels to you, you know, because I hear that from how you speak. And, you know, I used to work for the Global Eco-Village Network, which was a very, very diverse coming together of voices, and it's quite a shift for me to work in such a white environment, actually. And I'm really missing it. I'm missing the diversity. And we set up the scholarship project to also kind of open the doors more. But then it's quite a long pathway with Thomas to come into like positions of leadership and facilitation. And I don't know how to solve it yet. You know, that's just what I can say. I don't know how we're going to create safe places that are inviting enough, that are honoring enough, that bring enough dignity to your experience, you know, that this is a place that you could call home. And I feel like we need to learn from you, you know, and we need to do our own work, you know. So I was just saying to Ruby, you know, we just need more conversations, and maybe I could just invite you in to a next conversation, Larissa, you know, where we're like wanting to find out how can we shift this.
Mm-hmm. And Larissa, I'd love to hear kind of what you would like to see, right? Like what would make it a welcoming space for you?
Thank you. So Kosha, I understand about the leadership, but this is the community. So to me, there's a strong element of the outreach. Who is being reached by what Thomas puts out in the world? So Ruby, what I would like to see is when I come into the space that the optics are there, that there are enough brown faces and faces from other parts of the globe than Europe and the American dominated worldview, that I feel it's my family. You know, I mean, of course, you're all part of our family, but you're the parts that have had a very different experience. So I would like to see people that I can feel, nominally at least, have had experiences that we have in common.
Yeah, and then one other thing I'll add, as you talked about that, I think from the Trauma Summit earlier, that several groups have approached Thomas to do other trauma summits, and I think one was Africa, and there was another one, Kosha, and I don't know if you remember. And so I think as when you talked about outreach, who's getting the invitations, who's getting the word, who feels moved to be a part of a community, right? Because you can also get the outreach, but if you feel like that's not your space, then you won't come either. So yeah, so Kosha, I think it was Africa, right? And I think it was another one, and I don't want to.
It was Latin America, so Africa and Latin America. And I think there is simply the reality, you know, that Thomas started his work in Austria and then Germany. and then Israel, you know, and then slowly it grew from there. So I think, you know, there is that reality to it. And I agree, Larissa, you know, how do we do our outreach? And how do we also then, you know, when people do come, like you are here now posing this question, you know, how can we help you to feel welcomed as a trailblazer? You know, that it's also people like you to speak out now, right here, what you bring is part of the shift. You know, you're doing it right now. And I see also Mariama having her hand up next. So Mariama is doing it and Stephen is doing it, you know, this is like, yeah. And that, you know, that your voices are welcome. And you telling us, you know, that didn't feel good, you know, or I would have loved this message to go out differently. So I could have shared it with my community and they would have felt welcome. But the way this was put didn't feel right to pass on. You know, that kind of, that, you know, this is welcome. We're wanting to learn, you know, this is like, we're dedicated to healing fragmentation and addressing individual, ancestral, and collective trauma. And each new person who brings their ancestry, you know, it's like, that's our learning, you know, that's our dignity, our honoring of life. So, you know, I personally want to welcome you to send your feedback and let us know, you know.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe over to Mariama.
So good afternoon, good evening, good night, everyone. Welcome. Thank you. It's lovely to see you, Ruby, and you have such a lovely presence.
Thank you.
I'm just sitting here, just so amazed at how you've managed to link the academic work that you're doing, the research, including on just this high topic of genomics, with community care and community health care, and with teenagers and all of the various strands of life that we need to bring together. And I think that that's the approach that we need. And we need more people like you who are doing that. I wanted to ask a question about how you manage to take care of yourself and self-regulate, because I'm sure you have a lot of challenges with people telling you that's not rigorous work, that's not academic work, because you know you're an activist researcher, you're an activist scientist, and there's always that. Plus, you're a woman of color, a Black woman, so that trying to also maintain that I'm a rigorous scientist while doing community outreach. Those, you know, I'm an economist myself, and I get that kind of pushback too, but it's not rigorous work. So I wanted to ask that. I wanted to thank Larissa for bringing up the issue, which I hadn't yet gotten to, which was about the traversing these different spaces. Because when I come on, when I see the thing, and the first thing I do is I scream. I look to see. I say, there's Ruby. There's a Black woman, right? And then I'm looking through gallery view, and I'm screaming. I say Stephen, right? And then I'm like okay, so that's good. And I think a lot of it is, again, the networking and inside networking, how the outreach is done. And I was part of a project many years ago when I did a lot of popular economics work in the US with the funding exchange, which is out of New York. And it was put together by these kids who were inheritors of families, the Kennedys and others. And they put together the funding exchange so they could fund differently than their parental entity. And someone, a very wealthy person, gave them some money, and in the name of Lucy Parsons. So Lucy Parsons was a woman of color who was a union activist in many different ways. And one of the things that program allowed us to do was to go to community groups and activists and empower them to be able to take sabbaticals as leaders and go sit together. And they pick the topic, sit together for 5 days and discuss. And in that capacity, we were able to pay their organizations for their salary, we were able to give the woman money for her family and so forth. And that was a 2-year program. year-and-a-half program that really brought
Wow.
together women from poultry in the South, with garment workers in California, and garment workers and restaurant workers in New York City. So there are many kinds of ways to do that, and so that they could have a voice in moving forward in different ways. And I see many of them now on some of the environmental justice work that's impacting people of color and indigenous people. I think there's multiple ways, and some of it requires just the acknowledgement that there is this difference.
Yeah.
And I did the 4 months program on collective trauma. And I think after about the 6 weeks, there was, again, this question came up: why don't we have more facilitators and so forth that look like us? And so it was really very interesting to see how humble Thomas was and the team was. So we had a VIPOC group, and some of it is still going on. So I think the listening is there. It's just a matter now of how we do it, and how folks like Larissa, myself, and you and others. And it's really hard always to be pushing, because sometimes you stop yourself and say, oh gosh, I'm going to be bringing up here again. I'm going to be like, this person that's disturbing this peaceful place with my racial issue, my colonialism issue, my whatever it is. So how do you manage to do it and keep your sanity and keep going on?
Oh boy, I loved everything you said. I loved everything you said. And I'll try to address this. I mean, so it's rough, right? It's rough. A Black female in a predominantly white space in the academy has been rough. In fact, and one thing I'll say is we need your voices, just like Larissa questioned, your questions, right? Those help to set the tone. It helps to that, in fact, I would argue that's how you know a place is diverse, right? When you have people from different point of views, and even sometimes it's uncomfortable, and even sometimes it's disruptive, but it lets you know that there are people who are different, who have lived different lived experiences, and they need to be kind of a key part of it in the center. So I appreciate that. So how do I balance it? Like I said, it's been rough. One thing I'll say on a structural level that the university is now doing is, we have guidelines for tenure and policy, and they're putting public engaged scholarship, giving it its rightful place, I would argue, in terms of credit for those who do public engaged scholarship. So I recently was promoted to full, and those policies weren't quite in place as I was promoted, but for the most part, the university supported it, but it still was a way that a lot of the research and the actions weren't valued as much as some of the other more traditional type of scholarship. And for any who are kind of on tenure track or trying to figure out how to balance this, one thing I did do was when I would do some of the engaged scholarship, I would publish around it, right? So when you go up for tenure, you still have the publications and what you need. But like I said, the university is changing so that you don't have to do that double time, right? You don't have to do that double work, which is exhausting. And so that's one thing. And another thing in terms of kind of trying to keep, and I'm not saying I keep it all the time, right? There have been tears with George Floyd. I mean, and that's just a recent example. I was in the meeting, like just crumbling. And I actually talked to one of my colleagues because I tried to signal that, I needed some support, and they didn't pick up on the signal. And so we had this conversation about how, as a Black woman, right, like I am your colleague, and as a Black woman, the world is spinning with all of this social unrest, with all of this death of Black people time after time. It's crushing, right? It's crushing. And so when you see the kind of signal, right, and I know you care about me as a colleague, right, ask, are you okay? Nope, like this stuff is, I can't even curse on this thing, right, but this stuff is hard. So coping, plant gardens, family, ride my bike, music. I dance and listen to music all the time. And then sometimes just kind of get quiet, right? And the women in my study have taught me. I wrote a paper about quiet, right? And I call it the sovereignty of quiet. And then, so maybe when you said kind of this public, the support for these individuals who are on the front line, and I'm not even on the front line, right? I'm in the academy kind of traveling to the front line. They are living, sleeping, eating, breathing on the front line, and I see the cost that it takes, and that's part of helping these 50 organizations. So hopefully, someone asked about allyship. That's one way, right, to fund the sabbatical of someone that you see is on the front line doing just amazing stuff that everybody can't do, right? Because it'll just exhaust you, right? And you can't, and not like it doesn't exhaust them, but sometimes some people can do it better than others. And the last thing I'll say, maybe with the Pocket Project is maybe there's some writing, maybe there's some kind of session where the whiteness and what it feels like to others, that it's a long extended conversation, maybe like an hour or hour and a half conversation, and people can say what it feels like, because the work is powerful, but sometimes the space that the work is in, it makes it maybe challenging for some to come, and maybe that could be a open conversation where a discussion about next steps could be had. So that's just kind of another thing based on what you said. But thank you again. You saw, you appreciate my life, and I can tell from the questions that you asked, you know about the struggle, right? Maybe sitting here smiling and cheerful, but there have been some times, right, where you have to justify what you're doing, and it's that stress, right? So, and then this is the last thing. So I talk in my genomic research, the mothers talk about their hair falling out, stomach aches, backaches, and the Black women in the academy have some of those same issues, right? Because racism, even across class and gender and other things. So thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. And thank you also for the idea of that conversation, Ruby. I think that's great. And we're looking forward to the call with you. That's coming up very soon. And then, yeah, that can be a next step. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Just to say, is it okay, Ruby, that we go a bit longer, that we go until
maybe like 5 more minutes?
Five more minutes.
Yes.
So it depends on your answer, really.
I know. Okay, I'll be short.
I mean, first of all, I just want to say I'm so grateful to God to hear you speak and to hear you bring these issues to the table. Like it's been such a deep longing within me, and truly, thank you.
Thank you.
I hear you speak about building discomfort resiliency, and how witnessing creates disruption. My question is around when you're in the face of resistance to change, and you know that something is not right, and you can feel it in your body, in your embodiment. How do you meet this? Like, how do you fight the resistance to change?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example, again, from my work on racial microaggressions, right? So when I started here, there was a big debate around the chief, right? Native American mascot that many people wanted to have it stop, some didn't. And so we came together as a group to just kind of see what was the climate, what can be done. And so we started a racial microaggression project to get a sense of how people of color felt on campus, how the students felt. And then we went to educate different departments. And there was some resistance. And I don't think I realized the level of it until, and there was acceptance of it, and the university funded some of the research. So even though it talked about some of the things happening, they, to their credit, funded some of it. But I was in a meeting and someone was like, yeah, you're in the belly of the beast. And I was like, wow, I hadn't kind of thought about it like that. But so that's one way where it wasn't just me, it was a group said, okay, this is the context. We want it to be something else, right? We don't want to put our lives into a place where racism continued in subtle ways. And so then went to C, right, to investigate, to ask people when we got the information, then went and said, okay, this is what it is. This is how people are saying they feel. Here's another way to be, right? Like we have to be like this. Here's another way to be. And I think that in some ways it was helpful, but again, as I said before, right, structural inequality, it's a, right, it's been around and it's very entrenched, right? Oppression and all of that. So that's just one example. But I do, even in other places, I do try to speak, and sometimes I have to think about the words that I use, but I do try to speak and to, you know, to try to come up with some suggestions as well. So.
Word, thank you so much. As a Native American woman, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And I look forward to attending your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much, Ruby. I feel like you brought something super precious, and in a way it came, you know, it was like behind your words. What you shared with us was behind your words, and I really honor that, you know.
So say more behind my words. Yeah, so say more. It's
well, I mean, just to me, it came out also in what Mariama said and what you said. You know, you spoke a few times about what it felt like to you around George Floyd. You know, you got to that a few times, and there were a few times when you touched a much deeper lake. That you work from and that you're connected to the whole time. And just to honor that and to start feeling that with you. I think that's really what is also part of where we need to go, you know.
I mean, I think and I appreciate you saying that. I'm glad I asked you to say more because and what was interesting about George Floyd is that a lot of people, mostly white people, right, started to say, oh, wow, there's something here. And whereas people of color and other oppressed groups, right, you live with it daily. It affects you daily. You're scanning your environment daily to see if you're safe. And I think when people say, who's in the space, because then also that knowledge, right, that, as you say, that felt sense of kind of both knowledge, but also hurt, right, trauma is there. And so that's what you picked up. And I did try to let the guard down some to let you know that it's a cost, right, to be Black female in America. It's a cost, and there are many people paying the cost in many ways around the world. With we can end it, right, with climate change, and again what they lose when the environment is shifting, and the compassion that it takes, and the ability to see and imagine what it must be like, even if that's not your lived experience. I think it's something that we can grow as a society, as a humanity, or as humanity.
Yeah, thank you, Ruby. And I really invite everybody who's here today to come to the call on the 22nd. I think it's a community call.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure actually right now.
Is it a
global?
But it's on the 22nd. Right.
Anyway, it's soon, and I really invite us all to come, and that this is a thread that we don't let go of. And, you know, just my deep gratitude to you and to Mariama and to Larissa and to Catherine for, you know, being here. Stephen, I'm just seeing you up there too, Stephen, for being here and for speaking up. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all the comments in chat, but thank you. It's been my pleasure.